Christ is risen, indeed he is risen. Alleluia. Welcome to Veritatis Vox, a new channel devoted to being a voice for the voice of truth, who is our Lord Jesus Christ, risen from the dead. My name is Matt Gaspers, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by an esteemed guest from across the pond, you might say, Henry Sire, the author of the now famous book, The Dictator Pope. Henry is a historian and author. He's also written an excellent book we're going to talk about today as well. This came out before The Dictator Pope. It's called Phoenix from the Ashes, the Making, Unmaking, and Restoration of Catholic Tradition. And we're going to talk today about the legacy of the recently deceased Pope Francis and really the path forward that he and I, in our assessment, see as necessary for getting the church back on track after this tumultuous pontificate. So thank you, Mr. Sire, for joining us today.
Pleasure to be with you.
So I just trying to think back to the early days of the Francis Pontificate. I was actually one who I didn't know anything about Jorge Mario Bergoglio before he was announced on the loggia and stepped out there and said, what was it? Buonasera, famously, good evening. I don't know if you knew much about his background before that, but in the first few days and weeks, I remember kind of being hopeful personally about his pontificate. I remember in his first few sermons, he mentioned, themes of spiritual warfare and needing to be on our guard against the wiles of the devil, things like that. So it sounded like he might end up being a good pope, but obviously time proved me very wrong in that regard. What was how much did you know about Cardinal Bergoglio beforehand?
I didn't know about him at all. He wasn't one of the cardinals who'd been mentioned by the media. He was a complete surprise as far as I was concerned. And let me say that I had much the same reaction as yourself. I didn't know whether he was going to be good or bad. For the certainly the first year, even 2 years, I was waiting to see how he would turn out. Then one had plenty of evidence on which to base one's judgment.
Yes. And I mean, as I'm sure you would agree, there were from, he was elected March 13th, 2013. I mean, even within that first year of his pontificate, he started saying and doing things that were concerning, questionable, like his trip to I forget where, Buenos Aires, I guess, for that World Youth Day, where he told the youth to make a mess, something to that effect. And of course, it was
Well, it wasn't after that was before he became Pope, in fact.
I think it was in June of 2013, if I recall correctly. It was
Well, in
only
that case, it wasn't Buenos Aires because he hasn't gone back to
or no.
Argentina
Oh, yeah,
during
you're
the whole
right.
time.
It wasn't Buenos Aires. I forget the city where it was. It was somewhere in South America, not Buenos Aires.
Perhaps
You're
somewhere
right.
else in South America, yes.
And then it was on that plane ride back, that was the first of his what became infamous airplane interviews where he made the famous comment, "Who am I to judge?" And you mentioned that in your book, of course. He was talking about Monsignor, who was it, Ricci, I think, or Ricci. I can't remember his name.
Ricci, yes, a name like that, yes.
Yes, Battista Ricci, I think, this infamous, homosexual cleric that Francis defended, and that's unfortunately became a theme throughout his pontificate, even though he claimed to be about reforming the church and all of that stuff. So I guess for me, the real concerns I started coming to a boiling point during the family synods, of course, which you mentioned in your book, but also the publication of Amoris Laetitia was definitely a turning point, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
Yes, and the theological critiques of that document that came out, and then we had the dubia, of course, and the filial correction, as it was called. So yeah, it's been quite a 12 years. This year marks the 8th anniversary of the Dictator Pope. It's hard to believe it's been that long already. And one of the main themes in the book you mentioned is the St. Gallen Mafia, the group of cardinals, progressive prelates who were led by Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini, who passed away in 2012. They were trying to get a liberal, progressive minded Pope elected. They failed at the 2005 conclave, but were successful in 2013. So you mentioned something in your book called the Martini Agenda. I know Edward Penton has written an article in the past kind of describing what that means. Maybe you could describe it a little bit for us. And would you say that he was pretty successful in implementing that agenda?
Oh, yes. The whole of Francis's pontificate consisted in implementing the St. Gallen agenda, which is basically throwing doctrine overboard and appealing to modern secular opinion.
Mm-hmm.
That's it in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. And I think the means by which he did that was certainly these synods, which never. I know that Paul VI instituted the modern synod of bishops. I think that was even during the council. It was before the council, shortly before the council closed in what was it, December of 1965, when the council closed. So it's not like Francis invented the modern system of synods, but it seems like they've taken on an extraordinary, unusual prominence during his pontificate. Why do you think that is? Why did he use those processes of synods?
Well, the first thing to say about these synods is that they're completely fraudulent. But you've got to go back to Paul VI for that. As a matter of fact, I was under the impression that the first meeting of the Synod of Bishops was in 1967 when the Novus Ordo was proposed to it.
Mm-hmm.
The new liturgy was celebrated before the bishops for the first time to see whether it would get their approval. It didn't. It was not approved by a majority of the Synod of Bishops, and yet Paul VI went ahead with it all the same.
Mm-hmm.
So these synods have been fraudulent from the start, but they've been far more fraudulent under Pope Francis because, of course, he's a consummate politician. He spent his life manipulating people, and that's what the synods are for.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that I've noticed over the years, that various Vatican documents and Pope Francis himself have gone to great lengths to connect I don't know if great lengths is the right way to say it, but they've clearly connected the synod, specifically the most recent synod on synodality, to the Second Vatican Council, going back to Paul VI and John the 23rd. And Francis actually, on more than one occasion, connected his pontificate to Vatican II in various ways. So I was curious to know what connections you see between the council, the synod, and Francis. And this observation from Professor Roberto De Mattei always sticks out to me as very poignant. He said this during a 2018 speech that I was able to attend. He said, Pope Francis represents Vatican II in action. What do you say?
Yes, absolutely right. And when I say that the synods have been rigged, this also goes back to the Second Vatican Council, because the first session of the Vatican Council was a perfectly fair, certainly intended to be a perfectly fair representation of the whole world. It had as moderators or presidents of the sessions 8 cardinals taken from all over the world. I forget, is it 8 or 12 now, but certainly that sort of number of cardinals.
Mm-hmm.
When then, of course, Pope John the 23rd died. When Paul VI took over, he handed over the presidency of the council to just 4 cardinals, 3 of whom were extreme liberals, all of them Western Europeans, completely ignoring the genuine voice of the rest of the world. And this is the way he managed the council for the next 3 years. He slewed it completely in favor of the Western liberals, the Germans, the French, the Belgians, and the Dutch.
Mm.
So this, in that way, Pope Francis is very much a fulfillment of what happened in the Second Vatican Council. I think the difference you can point out is that Francis is more of a shameless manipulator than Paul VI was.
Yes, yes, that certainly seems correct as well. And so, what was I going to say here? Yeah, the connections between Francis and Vatican II are definitely many, many. And I was also going to note, so in your book, The Dictator Pope, well, actually, before we go on to that, I wanted to make an important point I think we discussed before we went live, that to really understand the Francis Pontificate, we need to place it in the broader context of the crisis in the church that's been going on for decades. I think there's a temptation among, what you might call conservative minded people as to more traditional minded people to blame the situation in the church entirely on the last 12 years of Francis, which is neither accurate nor fair really to him.
Well, there are a lot of people with a very short view of Catholic history.
Yeah,
Practically everybody in the church nowadays thinks that the Catholic Church began in 1962 with the Second Vatican Council, and a large proportion of them seem to think that it began with John Paul II. They have no memory of anything before him. I'm afraid
right.
we have to contend against that short historical view.
Yes, and that's one reason why I appreciate your book Phoenix from the Ashes so much, because it provides that the grand scheme of church history, salvation history, really begin. It's divided into two parts for those who aren't familiar. This book, by the way, is available from Angelico Press. I'm pretty sure I included a link. Yeah, I did include a link to it in the description to this show, so you can check that out later. But it's divided into two parts. The first part really is called the building of Catholic tradition, which basically beginning in AD 33 and going through 1962. And then part two is called the dismantling of Catholic tradition, which begins with chapter 9 on the Second Vatican Council,
So,
and then
sorry, what
goes.
date did you give for the beginning of Catholic tradition?
I think. Oh, probably. I suppose I was just kind of summarizing generally AD 33, like with this
Oh,
founding of the
AD
church, more or
33.
less.
All right, fine,
Yeah.
yes.
Yep. And then part two deals with more modern history. Vatican II, basically up through. Your book was published in 2015, so 2014, 2015, around there. And you describe in the introduction, I just want to read a little bit of this because it really gives the larger context to understand the Francis Pontificate. You talk about the history of human redemption is the history of the frustration of God's purposes. It begins with a calamity so radical that we cannot even imagine what the state of humanity would have been if God's plan had been obeyed and sin had not entered the world, obviously referring to original sin, the sin of Adam and Eve. And you say it continues with the repeated falls of the people chosen by God for his saving action. And then you summarize, the founding of the church, which began with 3 centuries of persecution, and then all with the rise of Constantine, and the church was kind of came into her own, so to speak, and was accepted by the world. But then you mentioned the course of victory was turned back. The past 5 centuries have seen a progressive turning away of what used to be Christendom from its old allegiance. And then you get into more modern turns of events, but you mentioned throughout history, church are chief among the reasons for reverses have been failures within the church itself. And that's a key point. You talk about two of them are periods of moral decay, and then the other three have been times when the church's life was threatened by the intellectual currents of the age. They are the Arian crisis of the 4th century, the invasion of rationalistic thought that preceded the French Revolution, and finally, the greatest failure of all, the surrender to the modern world that has corrupted the church in our own time. And that's really the lens through which we have to see the Francis Pontificate and all the disasters, is that that's what he came into. He didn't start the crisis. He entered into it and um, took it to its logical conclusion, I guess you could say. And specifically, he entered into um, the heresy known as modernism, which you mentioned on page 2 of your book in your introduction. Um, this is the school of thought which basically opposes the notion that you say um, the principle that tradition is, with authority and scripture, one of the 3 pillars of Christian doctrine, and a related principle that the church's teaching is unchangeable. So modernism rejects that view, which is why it's such a dangerous error. And that's the lens through which we have to understand Francis. He is, as Bishop Bernard Fillet said as early as, I think it was October of 2013, assessing Francis at that early stage, he said something like, "We have before us a genuine modernist," and that was definitely the case. My first interview on this new. Go ahead.
Well, I would just comment. Yes, I mean you say the modernist rejection of fixed doctrine, but you've also got to regard it as a simple inability of people to escape from the intellectual climate of their time.
Mm,
Uh, this was the essential problem with the Second Vatican Council, and it's also very much the trouble with Pope Francis. He was essentially a man of his time in every way.
yes.
A time which has passed, let me add. You know, he was a representative of the Vatican II generation, but those people are very old nowadays, and there's a new spirit in the church.
Hmm. Interestingly, on that note, I follow a few journalist friends of mine who are in Rome right now. Edward Penton, for example, also Diane Montagna and Michael Hines from LifeSite News. And this morning, Diane posted an English translation of a Holy See press office um, dispatch, and I'll just read a little bit of it. This is apparently what the cardinals are talking about heading into the conclave. So this was published this morning, May 5th. It's providential that we're having this discussion today because it is the traditional feast of St. Pius V, the champion of the traditional Latin Mass and who did so much good for the church in his time. We certainly should be praying for a successor to Francis who is like Pius V. But this is what the Holy See reported this morning for journalists. It says, this morning, the 10th Congregation of Cardinals began punctually at 9 in the morning with a moment of shared prayer. It was attended by 179 cardinals, of whom 132 were electors. At present, according to the Holy See, there are a total of 133 electors in the conclave. Um, and it's required to have a 2/3 majority. So I think that puts the number of cardinals needed to elect the Pope at around, I think, 88, 89, 90,
Mm-hmm.
somewhere in that range.
89 is the figure I've seen, yes.
Yes. So interestingly, um, here's what they have to say. During these meetings, cardinals stand up and give interventions or short speeches, what they think is important. Um, it says some cardinals who spoke evoked Pope Francis's touching prayer during the days of COVID, remembering it as a door open to hope in a time of fear, which I find ironic because, as I recall, Francis was very adamant about pushing the need to be vaccinated and also the quarantining and the closing down of the churches. He was all in favor of that, so kind of ironic there. Um, but they also go on to say the profile of the future pope was also discussed. A figure who must be present, close, capable of being a bridge and a guide, of favoring access to communion for a disoriented humanity marked by the crisis of the world order, a shepherd close to the real life of the people. Uh, those, I don't know if that describes Francis or not. What is your assessment of
Certainly
that?
not. I mean, it depends how you interpret all those things.
Yeah.
I wish we could have somebody like that, but Francis didn't fit that description at all. I mean, he was basically a politician,
Yes.
a politician who knew how to spout slogans, which, of course, are reproduced in the extract you've just read.
And something else that struck me, we were just talking about the Second Vatican Council and how, I mean, there are virtually no men left who personally participated in the council, or maybe a very few handful. And yet the council still seems to be at the forefront, apparently, during these congregations. It also says among the conciliar texts, so in other words, they're discussing the texts of Vatican II, the Constitution Dei Verbum, nourishment for the people of God, was mentioned. So it still seems to be at the forefront. It's like this thing, they're still trying to understand apparently the right interpretation of it, or et cetera, et cetera. And what they really need to confront are the ambiguities, the problems with the conciliar text, but also how it's been implemented over the years in a modernist fashion.
Yes, I mean it's absolutely incredible that you have prelates appealing to the Second Vatican Council without noticing the elephant in the room, which is that the council has been followed by one of the most well, not one of the most the most disastrous period for the church pastorally in the whole of its history.
Yes. Yes, I wish there were more cardinals who understood that, because even the better among them, like Cardinal Burke, Cardinal Sarah, Cardinal Mueller, for example, I think all of them are still pretty much convinced that the council itself is a good and holy thing, and it just hasn't been properly applied. But as Bishop Schneider, he gave a he and Diane Montagna did an excellent book-length interview a few years ago called Christus Vincet, which is also published by Angelico Press, the same publisher that put out your book Phoenix from the Ashes. And I forget the exact quote, but he's basically saying, trying to apply Benedict XVI's hermeneutic of continuity to every jot and tittle of Vatican II is simply not possible. It's not being honest, essentially. We have to be honest about the fact that there are some certain phrases in certain texts that are simply not reconcilable with Catholic tradition. And that needs to be recognized openly and honestly.
Yes, but it's not just a matter of words. It's a matter of the concrete effect that these documents have had.
Yes.
Uh, the the teaching of the Second Vatican Council has led to a complete collapse in the theology of the priesthood,
Mm.
and the formation of the priesthood. You've got to look at the facts, not spend your time quibbling about words.
Right. I agree with that. And I want to give another concrete example. I think, in my opinion, one of, if not the worst, um, objectively heretical statement of Francis throughout his entire pontificate was the Abu Dhabi Declaration of 2019, which included the
Yes.
phrase that the pluralism and the diversity of religions, and then it lists other, like race, language, sex, something like that, are willed by God in his wisdom through which he created human beings. The obvious problem being that these other characteristics that he's listing are objectively positively willed by God, like the difference in sexes, the sexes, male and female, different languages, etc. Those are positively willed by God. God obviously does not positively will false religions. So that claim is objectively false, and it does qualify as heretical. It's against the faith.
It's directly contrary to the words of Christ. No man comes to the Father but by me.
Right.
Uh, there could be no clearer heresy than that.
Right.
A direct opposition to the words of Christ.
And yet Francis, and I think he was correct in saying this, he said, on the plane ride home after he signed that document in February of 2019, I openly reaffirm this. From the Catholic point of view, the document does not move 1 millimeter away from the Second Vatican Council. Now, he did mistakenly say the council is even cited several times, which that's incorrect. The Vatican II documents are not cited explicitly in that human fraternity document, but nonetheless, he said the document was crafted in the spirit of the Second Vatican Council, and that is 100% correct. So, talking about, you mentioned we have to look at the effects of the words and not merely the words themselves. Well, the effect of the words of Vatican II, and in turn Francis's words in that Human Fraternity Abu Dhabi Declaration, resulted in a monstrosity known as the Abrahamic family house structure in Abu Dhabi. And I want to pull up a picture of that if I can. Let me see if I can
I wasn't
find
aware
one.
of that.
So I'll share this on the screen. I wrote an article a couple years ago for when I was with Catholic Family News, and yes, so let me see if I'll see if I can play this video footage and you can see. I don't think you'll be able to hear the sound yet. Here we go. So you probably can't hear the sound playing, but you'll see eventually what these buildings look like. And these were erected as a result of Francis's Human Fraternity document, the Abu Dhabi Declaration. I think you'll see the outside of these. There it is. So it's three buildings, a mosque, a synagogue, and a church that look identical to each other, and they're all in Abu Dhabi. And it's basically
All
like
equally hideous.
exactly, all equally hideous. Yes, and it's like the incarnation, if you might say, of the document. It's
Yes.
terrible. So I should have pulled up a still picture before we started. I didn't think to do that, but I'll share this article of mine so people can read about it if they want to in the live chat. But it's like it's a monument in stone to really the spirit and some of the letter of Vatican II, that these basically communicating to the world that all religions are equal, because the churches, all the buildings look the same, they're equally hideous, as you rightly said. It's terrible. It's terrible. So, we're
Well, I
talking.
mean,
Oh, go ahead.
it's a question of how you do interpret the Second Vatican Council. I do interpret it that way. I think it did point to indifferentism. There are those who try to save the orthodoxy of the council by saying that it did nothing of the sort, and they say, in what words did the council teach this? Well, perhaps the words weren't there, but the effect has certainly been there.
Yes, and that's what I demonstrate in this article that I wrote. That basically a fair reading of two texts in particular, Nostra Aetate, excuse me, and Dignitatis Humanae, basically give us the Abu Dhabi Declaration and this monument to human fraternity in Abu Dhabi. So that's because I'll just read a little bit from this article. It says, um, as I mentioned, the council is not actually cited explicitly in the Abu Dhabi Declaration. It clearly shares common ground with conciliar themes and texts, in particular Nostra Aetate and Dignitatis Humanae. So this document on human fraternity declares, for example, quote, the adoption of a culture of dialogue as the path, mutual cooperation as the code of conduct, reciprocal understanding as the method and standard. This is what it's promoting, while Nostra Aetate similarly calls on Catholics to engage in, quote, dialogue and collaboration with the followers of other religions. It's literally using the same language: dialogue, cooperation, collaboration. And Nostra Aetate says we are to, quote, preserve and promote the good things, spiritual and moral, as well as the socio-cultural values found among these men who hold false religions. Some of those religions blaspheme our Lord and the Holy Trinity, namely Islam and Judaism. So it's just unbelievable.
Well, yes, you can spout as much of that jargon as you like, but try confronting these people with the words of Christ, which I quoted before, no man comes to the Father but by me. Do they believe that, or don't they?
Yes, that's exactly right. That is the question. So getting back to our a theme for today of kind of assessing Francis's legacy, there were a couple of things that even from the very beginning, as I recall, Francis, Edward Penton mentioned this during our interview last week, that Bergoglio really made a big splash, you might say, in one of those general congregations of cardinals, or a couple of them in 2013, going into the conclave, where he talked about the need for reform. That's always the buzzword that they use when they really mean revolution. But one of the things that really got him a lot of attention was his stress on the need to reform the Roman Curia, which he would talk about that year after year during his Christmas address to the Roman Curia, that the reform needed to happen and it's going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. So finally, after years of talking about it, he finally issued a document in March of 2022, an apostolic constitution intended to replace John Paul II's Pastor Bonus, which was about the Roman Curia and reforming it. And in Predicate Evangelium, which is Francis's document, he says, um, he talks about the need to, quote, attune the Roman Curia's present day activity more effectively to the path of evangelization that the church, especially in our time, has taken. But I always found it curious that he constantly talked about the need to evangelize, and yet he never said that anyone needed to convert. I mean, what is the point of evangelization if you're not trying to win souls for Christ? So I thought that was kind of a sham. But how would you assess his efforts at reforming the Roman Curia overall?
Absolutely nil. You don't reform an organization like the Vatican by documents. You reform it by the men whom you appoint. This
Mm,
idea that the dicastery for evangelization is now the leading dicastery in the Vatican, absolute rubbish. What Francis did was to entrench the dominance of the Secretariat of State, personified by Cardinal Parolin, a totally secularist domination
mm,
of the Curia, and that's the reality. You can talk all you like about evangelization. If you have a collection of secular-minded politicians like Cardinal Parolin in charge, you're not going to have a spirit of evangelization at all. You're just going to have political maneuvering.
mm. And ultimately, that the prominence of Cardinal Parolin was Francis's Secretary of State, which is like deals with the temporal affairs of Vatican City as a nation state and such. Um, a friend of mine named Christopher Ferrara, who's done a lot of research into Fatima, for example, he's also written some other excellent books in regard to history and geopolitics. But he notes in one of his books that this also goes back to Paul VI, that the prior to Vatican II, prior to Paul VI, the the preeminent dicastery or office in the Vatican was always the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which makes sense because that is the church's primary focus, is the faith.
Well, this is a point which I could have made in my last answer. This
Mm,
secularization of the Curia actually goes back to the to Paul VI, as you
mm,
say. Until then, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, I think it had a previous title, was the first, the senior of the curial dicasteries. It was Paul VI who put the entire Curia, the entire Vatican administration, under the control of the Secretariat of State. And by doing so, of course, he completely secularized the whole government of the church.
mm.
Now, this has been taken to an extreme by Pope Francis.
Yes. Yes, even to the extreme. I mean, one of the chapters in your book, The Dictator Pope, let me refresh my memory as to the chapter title here, but here we go. Oh, yes. This is a very pithy title, Kremlin Santa Marta, that Pope Francis ruled the Vatican similar to the Kremlin in Soviet Russia, basically, and that it was interest. A lot of people interpreted him living at Casa Santa Marta as this great act of humility and whatever, but it was really more to have a pulse on the day-to-day activities of the cardinals, wouldn't you say?
Exactly, yes. That was the essential thing, yes.
Yes.
To control the cardinals and other Vatican officials, to listen to hear what they were saying, and to keep control in a way that no previous pope had done.
Right. So another plank in his political platform, you might say, for Francis was his supposed dedication to rooting out the causes of clergy sexual abuse, which sadly was not the case at all. If anything, it was made worse by certain things that he did, specifically not targeting, the vice of sodomy as being part of the root problem. So, how would you assess overall Francis's concern, for sexual abuse of minors and getting to the root of the problem? I think I'm sure we both agree that he failed miserably in that regard. But I'm curious to know your thoughts about all of that.
I'm not sure whether failed miserably is the right expression. He didn't even try. It was all talk, just as it
Mm-hmm.
had been when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires.
Mm-hmm.
He protected sexual offenders in the most shameless way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one
Of
of
course,
them,
the leading example of that is Father Rupnik, who
yes,
now seems to have lost his protection.
yes, I'm sure he is. He is a very nervous individual at this point right now, depending on who's elected. Maybe we can come back to Cardinal Parolin for a moment because he is unfortunately one who's considered papabile for this conclave. There's an excellent resource that I'll put up on the screen for those who might be interested. I showed this last week during my interview with Edward Penton, but there's a new website that he and Diane Montagna, together with a team of journalists, are running called the College of Cardinals Report. Let me share that on the screen so everyone can see this, what I'm talking about. Here we go. So this is what the homepage of the website looks like. It's very well done. And let me click on, oops, here we go. So at the top here, you can see click on conclaves and it kind of gives an introduction to the process of the conclaves, the history. Then if you click on cardinals here, and then on this tab or this toggle for papabili, you get the 22 that they have narrowed it down to as being, contenders for being elected the next pope. Parolin is on this list. I mean, and as you can see, most of them are not all that well known, I guess, to people outside of Vaticanistas, but the conservatives are in the small minority. We have, let's see, we'll go down the list here. We have Cardinal Burke would be certainly one of the conservatives, Cardinal Erdo, and then that jogs my memory. Before we went live, you brought up, we were talking about Cardinal Parolin, and apparently there was news circulating, a rumor, really nothing more than that, that he was in some sort of negotiations with Parolin was in negotiations with Cardinal Erdo, trying to, swing his voters his way or something to that effect. And Edward Habsburg, who is the ambassador for Hungary to the Holy See, posted. Let me see if I can share this now so people can see that is absolutely false. Absolutely
Yes.
false. Yes. So let me share this if I can. I think you all will be able
Yes,
to.
I think this must be a unique case of an ambassador to the Holy See intervening to deny a rumor about the conclave.
Yes, I can't imagine that happens very often, but this is a um, I don't know if it's a direct quote from Cardinal Erdo, but it's someone from close to him denying it outright. It says any speculation of a pre-conclave deal between Hungarian Cardinal Peter Erdo and former Vatican Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin is totally false. Cardinal Erdo has engaged in no such discussions. So there you have it.
Well, that points to the fact that that about a week ago there was a news item that Cardinal Parolin had the election sewn up. He had a huge majority, and it was even announced what his papal name was going to be. I mean, this just shows the appalling state into which Francis's pontificate has brought the church. That the idea of negotiations and pacts and so on during the conclave is taken for granted, whereas in fact they're completely forbidden by canon law.
Yes.
And it's taken for granted that there are these negotiations and bargains going on, whereby Cardinal Parolin could assure himself a majority. Nothing of that sort ought to be taking place at all. And yet, this is the state of politicization into which the church has been reduced.
Right. Yeah, it's a very sad state of affairs, to be sure. And for years, I've been concerned about Cardinal Parolin as being a potential successor to Francis. And the reason why that concerns me so much is Cardinal Parolin's, I don't know the man personally, but just my gut instinct, I guess you could say, or my sense about him is that he is a more shrewd and polished version, you might say, of Francis. And that would be very
Yes,
concerning to have.
a more disciplined version.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes, that
but
would be very concerning.
just as much a politician as Francis was.
Yes. Um, I definitely, I did another live stream earlier today discussing the situation regarding the further restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass in the Archdiocese of Detroit here in the United States. And, that certainly, in my opinion, one of the most contentious acts of Francis's pontificate was his decision to impose harsh restrictions on the traditional Mass. And interestingly, he taught, and I mentioned this during my previous live stream, but he said the tensions which surround this issue, this is Francis in a document from 2022, kind of his apologia for Traditionis Custodes. It's called Desiderio Desideravi. He says, the tensions which surround this issue, the problematic is primarily ecclesiological, he said, meaning that those who object to the liturgical form are out of step with, quote, the vision of the church so admirably described in Lumen Gentium. That is what he claims. And that's really an astounding statement. That's basically
Who
saying
is
that
the author of this?
Francis, it's from his letter Desiderio Desideravi in June of 2022, I believe it was, where he's saying that those who the tensions surrounding the Mass are ultimately ecclesiological in nature, that they're
Yes, it sounds very much like what Cardinal Roche says.
exactly right. And that's really an astounding claim, but honestly, I think it's correct that we have two competing versions of the church within the church right now. We have the traditional perennial Catholic vision of the church, and then we have this newfangled vision of the church that was introduced, via the Second Vatican Council and the reforms that followed. And they can't coexist in the church forever. Something has to be done about
Absolutely.
that. Something has to be done about that for sure. And actually, you talk about this a little bit in the closing chapter of your book. I wanted to read this quote for people and encourage them to read the book in full. Again, it's Phoenix from the Ashes, available from Angelico Press. And before I read this quote, I'll mention what you mentioned to me before we went live. It sounds like there's been it's been translated into Spanish, if I recall correctly. And
A gentleman has very kindly translated the book into Spanish, and it should be out in a month or so.
wonderful. And that's going to be published by Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, you mentioned.
Yes, this is Oswiusti, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yes, definitely. That's wonderful news. So if you have any people who are Spanish is their first language and they do better with a Spanish version, you'll know that have that available to you very soon. But so the subtitle again of his book is The Making, Unmaking, and Restoration of Catholic Tradition. And the final chapter of the book, chapter 15, is devoted to that latter subject, the restoration of tradition, in which you talk about, for example, the witness of Archbishop Lefebvre, conservative movements in the church, traditionalist institutes within the church, and getting in more into the details of the Society of St. Pius X. And then you end the, let me see here, I think I have it marked. You end the book, I just want to read this closing paragraph. I think it's very, very interesting. You say you venture to make a few pedestrian forecasts. Firstly, and I sincerely hope that this comes to pass under the next pope, or if not him, his successor, but sometime in the near future, all of these things. Firstly, within a very few years, it will be admitted in the church that the traditionalist criticisms of the Second Vatican Council, of Pope Paul VI, and of the liturgical reform are legitimate opinions for Catholics to hold. And I think that is even growing now as we speak. One example that comes to mind, I think, is Bishop Strickland, Joseph Strickland, who was basically fired illegitimately, you could say, by Pope Francis, removed from his diocese for no actual crime other than
Yes.
being faithful to Catholic tradition. He's coming to these understandings as well. Another one who comes to mind is Archbishop Vigano. I mean, unfortunately I don't agree with. I think he's probably taking it a little too far and not recognizing the validity of Francis and going down a more sedevacantist path, which I find unfortunate. But I still respect him for all the good that he did when he was testifying against Cardinal McCarrick and all of that stuff. I think the preeminent example, which I wish we had so many more bishops like him in the church, is Bishop Athanasius Schneider. I think
Yes.
he is the sort of man that we need as the next pope, in my opinion. If I had a vote in the conclave,
I suppose he can't be the next one, but possibly the next but one.
yes, hopefully he will be made a cardinal in due time. That would be wonderful. So anyway, getting back to your book, you talk about, the traditionalist criticism of Vatican II will eventually be recognized as legitimate. Uh, Next, you say within a generation or so, those criticisms will have taken their effect. The false altars will have disappeared from churches everywhere. The Mass of Ages will have been restored to its central place in the life of the church. The Society of St. Pius X will be one of the guiding forces in the ecclesiastical world, and the cause of the servant of God, Marcel Lefebvre, will have been officially admitted for the process of beatification and canonization. And I can't remember who, so I know that there was a cardinal who said publicly that he thought that not only would Archbishop Lefebvre be canonized, but he would also eventually be declared a doctor of the church. Wouldn't that be a turn of wouldn't that be quite a turn of events? That would be amazing to see. And then you say, and further on, quite possibly within 70 years, the Church will have pronounced its solemn condemnation of the Second Vatican Council and of Pope Paul VI's reign, and the pestilence of modernism will be no more than a memory in the Church.
Yes,
And
the figure of 70 years was because I was drawing the parallel between the absolutely desperate state that the church was in 1800, after the French Revolution, the vacancy in the papacy between 1800 and 1870, when the dogma of papal infallibility was defined, a complete revolution in the church. And what I was saying is that we can expect a comparable revolution within the same period of time.
yes, and it also, 70 is also a biblical number. The Babylonian exile comes to mind in the Old
That
Testament
hadn't
as well.
occurred to me.
So yes, that's definitely the case as well. Um, so looking ahead, I guess we've talked a lot about the legacy of Pope Francis, and it really has been disastrous and deeply wounding
Yeah.
to the mystical
But
body of
in
Christ.
connection with this, I'd like to say, what you've quoted is sort of theological, but I think one needs to emphasize the human aspect of this. That
Yes.
nowadays there's a whole generation that has sprung up who want to get back to sound doctrine
Mhm.
and to the spirituality of the Catholic tradition and to the traditional liturgy. And they're the people whom Pope Francis has been trying to suppress and, in fact, to denigrate, which he did repeatedly in the course of his papacy.
Mhm.
These are the future of the church. They they haven't been brought up on the Vatican II propaganda.
Mhm.
What they look at is the tradition of the church throughout its whole history, and they're going back to tradition. This is why I think that there is going to be this revolution in the near future.
Yes. Yes, I agree. So, looking ahead to the upcoming conclave, I suppose, as we're getting close to the hour mark, we'll start wrapping up. But how do you see the prospects of electing a good pope to follow Francis? And who are some of the men that you would look to as being, representing this group that you just described as being open to restoration and the restoration of tradition, for example?
Well, I've never accepted what a lot of people were saying, that Pope Francis had appointed so many cardinals that the next one is bound to be a second edition of himself. Um, a lot of the cardinals come from very out of the way parts of the world,
Mm.
and they don't really they never did share. Fr- sorry, they never did share Francis's school of thought. And what one has the impression in the last few days that these cardinals have been very ready to listen to the voices of the more experienced cardinals in the congregations. So things are looking fairly encouraging. There is certainly a tremendous danger. Um, the success or the apparent success of the candidacy of Parolin has been based precisely on this lack of experience of the vast majority of the candidates. I'm afraid that they are quite capable of being taken in.
Mhm.
It's a question of who they listen to. Are they going to listen to the official propaganda, or are they going to listen to the leading cardinals under Pope Benedict the 16th? People like Cardinal Burke, Cardinal Sire, Cardinal Muller, who of course has been very outspoken in the last few days,
Mhm.
as have several others. Who are they going to listen to? Of course, the most important thing is they should listen to the Holy Spirit.
Yes, absolutely. Another one who comes to mind, of course, is Cardinal Joseph Zen from China, from Hong Kong. And my friend
Indeed, yes.
Michael Hines from LifeSite News reported just today on Twitter or X. I always keep calling it Twitter. Cardinal Zen has warned cardinals that the new pope's decision on the future of the synod on synodality, quote, is a matter of life or death for the church founded by Jesus. And we certainly hope that the next pope puts an end to the synodality nonsense and gets back to the actual constitution of the church, and stops pushing all of these novelties. Because I think, as I recall, before Francis died, maybe I think it was even while he was in the hospital, now that I think about it, some news came out that he was extending the synodal process even further or something like that. And the implementation phase.
For a further 3 years, yes.
Yes, exactly. So that's something that definitely needs to be ended by the next pope. Um, I wanted to mention, to give a shout out again to Edward Penton. He published an interesting article on his website. Let me see if I can share that so everybody can see, and I'll share a link in the live chat. But he has, in addition to being the senior Vatican correspondent for the National Catholic Register, he also has his own website, which is displayed here in this article, where he talks about 10 critical issues facing the next Pope. And we certainly don't have time to discuss this in detail, but I'll just scroll through so you can see the 10 that he singles out. He says, return to a papacy as source of sound doctrine and unity. He also talks about clarification of Vatican II and reform of the Jesuits. That's something we haven't gotten to today, but that's also an interesting subject, that Francis being the first Jesuit Pope, and really the modernist heresy really germinated and became quite virulent, specifically in the Jesuit order. I think that also is a contributing something to help us understand the Francis papacy, is his Jesuit background, specifically his modernist Jesuit background. Edward also talks about restore traditional papal governance and collegiality to the College of Bishops and Cardinals, more reverence in the liturgy, end suppression of the traditional liturgy. Certainly the next pope or his successor needs to overturn the illegitimate Traditionis Custodes and restore the rights of the traditional Latin Mass in the Church. Number 6, Edward says, is distance from globalism, secularism, and ties to government funding. Zero tolerance on clerical sex abuse. Dealing with the issue of homosexuality in the Church, which sadly some of even the most prominent cardinals appointed by Francis are very pro LGBT, and even, for example, Francis promoting the infamous Father James Martin, Jesuit priest, to such a prominent position in the Vatican Dicastery for Communications. All of that needs to be addressed. Then number 9 is good stewardship of Vatican finances. And I believe I saw Damian Thompson, a British journalist, talked about that Cardinal Parolin, he found evidence that Cardinal Parolin was involved in that London property scandal. Do you know much about that? Do you recall that?
What Damon Thompson has published is an article detailing all the clerical sexual offenders whom Pope Francis had been protecting during his reign. I think the news story about Cardinal Parolin's signature appearing on this document for the London property, I think that was published by somebody else, but it's come out just today, hasn't it?
Yeah, I was going to see if I can
I
find that.
I think I think Damon Thompson has posted this, but I don't think he's the originator of it.
Yeah, I think he was just sharing news. Yeah, he was sharing a screenshot of. Let me see if I can share this on here. He said someone
Yes,
else published it, but he was spreading the word about it. Let me see if I can share
yes,
this on the screen, and then we can see what I'm talking about here. So here it is. He says this was apparently published by Il Tempo. Il
right.
Tempo reveals
Yes,
that
well,
Cardinal.
as you
Yeah.
see, the original articles in Italian.
Yes. So it says Il Tempo reveals that Cardinal Parolin's signature is on the document approving the scandalous London property deal that cost the church 140 million euros. So hopefully this is another strike against Parolin, and the Cardinals will have the good sense to not elevate him to the chair of St. Peter.
Yes, I think that the main mark against Parolin is his deal with communist China, which of course Cardinal Zen has made every effort to bring out. But as I remarked in an article a few days ago, no conclave in its senses would elect a man who'd been responsible for a political deal like that. Unfortunately, we have this very inexperienced, very naive group of cardinals who are capable of doing so. I hope they won't.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned your recent article. I want to show that to people. That's let me pull that up on the screen here. This is something that was published. What was it? The day.
This is the one about the cardinals.
I think this is the one from here. I'll display it on the screen so you can see. This is the one that you published, I think, the day after Francis's death.
Yes, yeah,
Oh,
well, no, it's a different article that I was referring
oh,
to.
okay. Okay, I'll have to read that one. I haven't, but maybe this would be a good point to end on. So, a a very important lens through which to understand the Francis Pontificate not only is the modernist crisis in the the early 20th century, but also specific to Francis is his relationship to the dictator Juan Perón. And I want to read this section from your book, The Dictator Pope, where you drive this point home very succinctly. So you say, and this is in what is it, chapter? I think the first or second chapter. Yeah, chapter 2, the Cardinal from Argentina. So you mention the story is told that Perón, in his days of glory, once proposed to induct a nephew in the mysteries of politics. He first brought the young man with him when he received a deputation of communists. After hearing their views, he told them, "You're quite right." The next day, he received a deputation of fascists and replied again to their arguments, "You're quite right." Then he asked his nephew what he thought, and the young man said, "You've spoken with two groups with diametrically opposite opinions, and you told them both that you agree with them. This is completely unacceptable." Perón replied, "You're quite right, too." An anecdote like this is an illustration of why no one can be expected to assess Pope Francis unless he understands the tradition of Argentinian politics, a phenomenon outside the rest of the world's experience. The Church has been taken by surprise by Francis because it has not had the key to him, namely, he is Juan Perón in ecclesiastical translation. Those who seek to interpret him otherwise are missing the only relevant criterion. End quote. So I think that's a very important point. I'm glad that you brought that up in your book, and maybe you could share a few closing thoughts with us how Pope Francis is the ecclesiastical version of Juan Perón.
Well, yes, we've had this flow of eulogies about Pope Francis since he died, and we've had all these newspapers quoting his words. But the trouble is his words didn't correspond to his acts. He was an unscrupulous politician who was always prepared to say one thing and completely ignore it in practice. His treatment of clerical sexual abusers is, of course, the glaring example of that. Also, his supposed reform of the Vatican, no reform at all. It's just a document with the most corrupt people placed in charge and placed in charge by Bergoglio himself. Um, this is this is the case across the whole range of Catholic life. Um, Pope Francis was prepared to say one thing and do something completely opposite.
Yes. Yes. So I suppose in closing, our hope and prayer is that that this trend does not
We
continue.
pray for an honest Pope.
Yes. First and foremost, simply an honest man, a man of virtue. I think I tend to agree with my friend Kennedy Hall. I interviewed. He was the first person that I interviewed on my new channel. I think you would enjoy his new book from Sophia Institute Press called "What Happened to Catholicism," and it's really about the modernist crisis and how we should be dealing with that because it is still the central issue in the church today. Most people don't realize that, and that actually brings me to. I wanted to read this quote from the introduction of your book. You talk about some defenders of the status quo want to deny that the present climate of thought can be identified with that modernism and are piously shocked at the names being applied. Um, but you say these are generally the same people who deplore the so called narrow mindedness of Pius X in condemning what they admire as a movement of enlightenment. So I think modernism is still very much at the root of the crisis that we face, and it's going to take a man who recognizes that. But Kennedy, in a live stream, I think last week, he was highlighting one of the papabili, Cardinal Pizzaballa, the patriarch, Latin patriarch of Jerusalem. as being a really solid candidate, and I happen to agree with him, mostly because he is a man of action and a man just in practice. He knows how to govern. He has a gift for administration, which I think the next pope is really going to have to have. He's also going to have to have an iron will to do what is necessary. You know, he obviously Donald Trump is very has many moral shortcomings, but if nothing else, you have to say the man has a will of iron, and he's willing to do what needs to be done to get the job done. We're going to
Yes,
need someone like that.
I, I hope you won't give the impression that Pizza Balla is going to be a sort of ecclesiastical version of Trump. That wouldn't be a good thing at all. No,
No.
one can mention a number of cardinals. Cardinal Miller, for example, if he were elected Pope, yes, he would explicitly try and restore Catholic orthodoxy. With Pizza Balla, I feel that if he were Pope, the whole of the nonsense of the past 12 years would simply become irrelevant. You would have somebody who is governing the church as it ought to be governed, an honest man, as I said before. What we need more desperately than anything else. Yes, so yes, I'm inclined to think that Cardinal Pizzaballa would be a good candidate.
And I think it would also be providential in light of the crisis in the Holy Land that's been going on for what I guess it started in October. Well, the latest, it's cyclical. It seems to come up over and over again, of course, over the last several decades. But the most recent spat of it since October of 2023, and it's been ongoing since then, to the point of the people of Gaza are suffering terribly. And um, I think it would be very powerful to have a strong advocate for them and a man who has lived most of his ecclesiastical career in the Holy Land. I think that would be marvelous to see.
Yes, well, as you know, I'm a historian of the Knights of Malta, and they had their origin in the Holy Land. And I've always believed that the modern knights ought to try and recover their vocation in the Holy Land. So I take a great interest in that part of the world. So I certainly recognise that would be very important. But of course, there are so many other things in the church which are equally or even more pressing.
Yes. And as I understand it, he's also favorable to the traditional Latin Mass. And even when he took possession of his titular church, I think that was last May, he didn't
Well,
celebrate.
I think this goes
But
back to what I said. He's an honest man.
yeah,
Why should he waste his time persecuting traditionalist Catholics and persecuting the traditional liturgy? He has better things to do.
yes, very well said. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I think that our audience has really enjoyed this. We have about 375 people joining us live right now, and I encourage all of them to check out uh, Mr. Sire's books, of course, The Dictator Pope. But I think honestly, the one that would probably be of more interest at this point is this one, The Phoenix from the Ashes, which gives this overview, this historical narrative of the last, of the entire church's history and what we're dealing with now. I really highly recommend this one as well, which is available from Angelico Press. And as I mentioned, the Spanish translation will be coming out soon. So thanks be to God for that. Do you have any closing thoughts or messages to share with the audience?
I think after what I've said about Cardinal Pizzaballa, anything else would be an anticlimax.
I agree. I think that's a good place to leave it. So thank you so much to everybody who's joined us live. If you've enjoyed our discussion today, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel, help the channel to grow. I'm really doing this as more of a hobby at this point. I work a full-time ordinary day job. I'm just doing this on the side, but we'll see what God has in mind for it. If he wants me to devote more time to it, we'll see what happens. Do you have, I meant to ask you as well, do you have any other projects in the works, any books or anything you'd like to mention that you have
I'm
in the
afraid not.
works?
I'm 75 and I'm not capable of producing any more books. The the Spanish edition of Phoenix from the Ashes is my last achievement.
Well, it's a monumental achievement, to be sure. And maybe we can talk again after the conclave, and we can either comfort each other in our desolation or rejoice in our in our excitement as to who's been elected. And I will share also that Mr. Sire and I, we actually conducted a written interview several months ago, but never ended up being published. So we are pursuing publication of that interview soon, probably through 1 Peter 5. My good friend Timothy Flanders has expressed an interest in publishing it, so keep an eye out for that. And as I like to do at the end of these live streams, just remind people the name of this new channel is Veritatis Vox, which means the voice of truth in Latin. And the inspiration for the name comes from our Lord's words in John chapter 18, verse 37, where he says to Pontius Pilate, "For this I was born, for this I came into the world, to give testimony to the truth. Those who are of the truth hear my voice." So let us make sure that we are those who are of the truth, who hear his voice and obey accordingly. So thank you so
And
much for
let's
joining.
remember that came immediately after Pontius Pilate had asked Jesus, "Are you the King of the Jews? Are you a king?" And Christ replied, "Yes, as you say, I'm a king." And that is very much related to the theme of truth. That we acknowledge Christ as our King.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Christ is King. Vivat Christus Rex. So thank you again for joining us today. And until next time, God bless you all and Godspeed. And have a wonderful afternoon or a wonderful evening, Henry. We'll talk again.
Thank you very much.